Then we have probably the crown jewel of our program, and that is a paid media program that is targeted not only at the mass population, but we have ethnic audience specialty firms that are subcontractors to Draft FCB, our prime contractors, and for each ethnic audience, the Asian, the African American, the Latino, there is a firm that specializes in that audience. It is the IW Group for the Asian markets, and so far they have contributed to a great degree, and we're at a point now of approving creative copy toward having final ads ready next fall. That campaign you will see next January. It'll run from January through next May. So when we put together our partnership program with our advertising program, with the local hiring that we do, when those come together, then I think we have a powerful program. And as one final thing I would mention, and I think and that has to do with languages. We have committed strongly, we've invested in the availability of forms and guides for over 59 languages. We recently added Asian languages to bring us to over 20 languages, 20 Asian languages that'll be part of our advertising program, and for which we will have language guides available to translate our forms into those Asian languages. So we are very, very committed to a complete census, to a census that addresses the increasing diversity of the Asian community, the Chinese American community. We recognize the prominence of the community, and we think we're plugged in. However, we know that it's through the relationship with groups like this that we will bring this to fruition and have a great census 1 year from now. So I thank you for inviting me, for recognizing that the decennial census is just around the corner, and I look forward to working with you as we move through this next 11 months. You have a wonderful panel. I look forward to discussion, and again, thank you for having me.
Thank you so very much. Now we turn to the findings, the unveiling of our survey that asks the question whether Asian Americans are still considered as the other. Let me provide you with some brief background. The Committee of 100 has been conducting surveys almost since it began. In 2001, we conducted a landmark survey, really the type of research that has never or rarely been done before, to study what other Americans thought of Asian Americans. That 2001 survey, which continues to be cited by the media and by scholars who study Asian Americans, formed the basis for our renewed work this year. We wanted to track some of the trends, to see the progress that we have made and the problems that remain. So we built on that survey and took a look at what has changed and what hasn't. We hired the renowned survey research firm of Harris Interactive. You may be familiar with their work, the Harris poll that they release on public attitudes from time to time, tracking all sorts of views on media and culture and politics. And we have the full results of the survey, a document of more than 75 pages, available to you for downloading on the website. We're also releasing it in hard copy shortly after this conference. Let me highlight just a few of the findings before turning things over to our panel to discuss the meaning of all of this, what it implies, what it tells us about this nation of ours, about our progress as this new wave of arrivals tries to assimilate and in turn take on its rights, its responsibilities within this nation. So we conducted a survey that was administered to about 1,200 adults, and we did a breakout to look at about 200 self-identified Chinese Americans. This survey took place, the fieldwork, in January of 2009. If you have a statistical background and you're interested in such things as margin of error, we're very proud of what we've done, and I would refer you to the website where you can take a look at all of the details. Among our findings are the following. We set out to do this work because so often, as perhaps you know, when you pick up the newspaper and you read about studies on race and ethnicity, the matters are framed in terms that are literally black and white. And so people who fit into neither category are excluded, are left out, or assumed not to belong or not to have any problems. And so we wanted to change that. We also thought that as we move beyond the literal black and white, that we would discover more than the figurative black and white, that matters are not so simple. And indeed, the picture that emerges is quite complex. There is no easy way to summarize the findings. We find the very positive alongside the very negative, the glass half full or half empty, depending on the perspective that you wish to take. So among the key findings we found are the following, that despite the progress we've made, there remains doubt about whether Asian Americans truly belong as Americans. Within the general population, almost half, 45%, believe that Asian Americans are more loyal to their nations of ancestry than to the United States. Surprisingly, that number has increased. In the 2001 survey, a mere 9 years ago, we found only 37% of Americans held that view. So rather than making progress in that regard, I would highlight that particular finding as showing that there is still skepticism about the very possibility of being, on the one hand, both Asian and, on the other hand, also thoroughly American. Though, as we know, there are fifth-generation Asian Americans, fifth-generation Californians of Asian descent, or Texans, and there are people, of course, who are adopted and of mixed-race ancestry as well. We found also that there is an inability to distinguish, that by and large, the attitudes people have toward Chinese Americans, they also have toward Asian Americans in general. People don't draw meaningful, they don't make meaningful distinctions among different Asian ethnicities. A substantial majority of the American population overestimates the number of Asian Americans there are. They underestimate the number or proportion of Asian Americans who are native-born, and surprisingly, more than a third of the general population reports rarely or never interacting with Chinese Americans or Asian Americans at work, in the community, or socially. More than a third. We also found, though, that there are many positive perceptions. About a quarter of the general population would feel uncomfortable voting for an Asian American as president, but 3/4 would feel comfortable doing so. That was in 2001. In 2009, the number feeling uncomfortable had declined to merely 9%. So by a better than 9-to-1 margin, people would feel comfortable voting for an Asian American candidate. The number of people who disapprove of Asian Americans as a spouse also has declined, and people on the whole feel positive about the contributions of Chinese Americans and Asian Americans. They also view Chinese Americans and Asian Americans as highly successful, as educated, having strong family values, being hardworking and intellectually bright, as well as being less prone to committing crime than other ethnic groups. So the view of Chinese Americans contrasts with the view of our fellow citizens. 3 out of 4 Chinese Americans say that Chinese Americans would support the United States, not an Asian nation, in the event of military or economic conflict, though only slightly more than half of the general population holds that view. Within the general population, 44% believe that Asian Americans should think in more American ways, and 20% believe that Asian Americans do not care what happens to anyone other than their own racial group. There is a good deal of skepticism among Chinese Americans and within the general population about law enforcement and this perception of foreignness and loyalty. 42% of the general population believes it likely the FBI would arrest an Asian American for spying without evidence, while among Chinese Americans, about 54% hold that view. So it isn't just Asian Americans who have that view. The general population does as well. Arab Americans have exactly the same percentage holding that view as Asian Americans. So interestingly, though, Chinese Americans perceive themselves to be less favorably regarded than in fact they are. I don't want to overemphasize the negative, by and large, our survey found that Chinese Americans and Asian Americans at large are being accepted within American society. Indeed, 87% believe that Asian Americans are fitting in well with the mainstream U.S. culture. There are also significant gaps, though, in the perception of whether Asian Americans have enough political influence, with, on the whole, non-Asian Americans believing that they do, and Asian Americans believing that they do not. We found that there's a correlation, too, between negative attitudes toward Asian Americans and age, lack of education,